Here is a question that sounds simple on the surface but becomes more uncomfortable the deeper you go. When was the Bible actually written? Not who wrote it. Not is it true. Just when. And yet, that single question pulls open a door that most people have never walked through. Because once you understand the timeline of how and when these texts were composed, copied, debated, and finally gathered into the book we hold today, you cannot read it the same way again. Whether that makes you more skeptical or more in awe, I genuinely don't know. That depends on you. But I do believe that not knowing this history is one of the most costly gaps in how people engage with one of the most influential documents in human civilization. So let's go through it. Honestly, carefully, and without an agenda. Just the facts, the timeline, and then I'll tell you what I personally think it all means. Let's start with something foundational that sounds obvious but rarely gets stated clearly. The Bible is not a book. It is a library. The Protestant Bible contains 66 individual texts. The Catholic Bible contains 73. And those texts were written across a span of roughly 1,500 years, by dozens of authors, in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, across 3 different continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. Let that sink in. 1,500 years. For comparison, the gap between us and the fall of the Western Roman Empire is only about 1,550 years. The Bible was being composed across a stretch of time almost equivalent to that entire distance. Now, why does that matter? Because it means there is no single when. There is no one moment when someone sat down and wrote the Bible. What we have instead is a long, layered, deeply human process. One that reflects the concerns, conflicts, and cultures of every generation that contributed to it. That is not a weakness of the text. In my view, it is one of the most fascinating things about it. The oldest portions of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, are thought to have been composed beginning around 900 to 800 BCE, though many of the traditions they record are far older, passed down orally for centuries before they were ever written. The first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, collectively known as the Torah or Pentateuch, were long attributed to Moses. And this attribution matters enormously to Jewish and Christian theology. But here is where things get interesting. When scholars began examining these texts carefully in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, they noticed something. The writing style shifts dramatically. The name used for God alternates. Certain stories appear twice with different details. Passages describe events that occur after Moses had died. This led to what became known as the documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Torah is actually woven together from at least 4 distinct source traditions, sometimes called the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly source. Each had its own theological emphasis, its own vocabulary, its own historical context. Now, does this disprove Moses' involvement? Not necessarily. It may mean that Moses wrote earlier material that was later incorporated, expanded, and edited. It may mean that later authors wrote in his tradition and name, which was a common practice in the ancient world. It conferred authority, not deception. What it does tell us is that these texts went through centuries of development before reaching their final form. The prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, were composed between roughly 760 BCE and 430 BCE. The wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, spans an even wider range. Some psalms may genuinely go back to David's era around 1000 BCE. Others show clear signs of having been written or edited during and after the Babylonian exile, which began in 586 BCE. The exile, by the way, is one of the most important moments in the history of the Bible. It is during and after those devastating decades in Babylon that scholars believe much of the Hebrew Bible was systematically compiled, edited, and given its final shape. Displacement has a way of making a people urgent about preserving their identity, their memory, their understanding of God. The Old Testament was not finalized even in Jewish tradition until approximately 90 CE, when the Council of Jamnia, a gathering of Jewish scholars after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple, established what texts belonged in the Hebrew canon. Interestingly, by that time, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures had been in circulation for centuries. It is called the Septuagint, and it included additional books, texts like Tobit, Judith, Sirach, the Wisdom of Solomon, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. that the Council of Jamnia excluded. This is why to this day, Catholic and Orthodox Bibles contain more books in the Old Testament than Protestant Bibles do. The Protestant reformers in the 16th century followed the Hebrew canon established at Jamnia. Catholics and Orthodox followed the older Greek tradition. Neither side is fabricating anything. They are simply drawing on different streams of a very old, very complex tradition. The New Testament is a much shorter time frame, but arguably more complicated, because the stakes around it feel more immediate. Here is something that surprises many people. The Gospels were not the first New Testament texts to be written. The letters of Paul, 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, the Corinthian letters, Romans, were composed between approximately 49 and 60 CE. Jesus died around 30 to 33 CE. That means Paul was writing about Jesus within 20 years of the crucifixion, while eyewitnesses were still alive. And here is what I find personally striking about that. Paul writes with urgency, not mythology. His letters read like a man responding to real crises in real communities, not constructing a legend. The Gospel of Mark, considered by most scholars to be the earliest of the four Gospels, was written around 65 to 70 CE. Matthew and Luke followed, probably in the 80s CE. Both of them drew on Mark as a source, and both had access to additional material, including what scholars call the Q source, a hypothetical collection of Jesus sayings that no longer exists as a standalone document, but whose contents can be partially reconstructed by comparing Matthew and Luke. John's Gospel is the latest, written around 90 to 100 CE, and it is the most theologically developed, presenting Jesus in language that echoes Greek philosophy and Jewish wisdom tradition simultaneously. Now here is where I want to say something that I think gets lost in both the skeptical and the devotional tellings of this story. The fact that the Gospels were written decades after the events does not automatically make them unreliable. In oral cultures, and first-century Jewish culture was deeply oral, memory worked differently than we assume today. Rabbis and their disciples memorized vast amounts of teaching with precision. Stories were told in structured ways that aided accurate transmission. The gap between events and the written record in the Gospel of Mark is roughly comparable to the gap between, say, World War II and the memoirs and histories published in the 1960s. We do not dismiss those accounts simply because they were written after the fact. At the same time, I think intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the Gospels do contain differences, in genealogies, in the exact sequence of events, in the wording of Jesus' sayings. These are real. They have been observed by scholars and theologians for centuries. In my view, these differences do not undermine the core historical testimony, but they do tell us we are dealing with human authors, writing from particular vantage points, for particular audiences with particular theological emphases. That is not a scandal. That is what every serious historical document looks like. Here is something that genuinely stopped me when I first understood it clearly. The Church existed for decades, arguably centuries, before there was anything you could call a fixed Bible. The early Christians had the Old Testament scriptures. They had Paul's letters circulating between communities. They had the Gospels as they emerged. But there was no agreed-upon list. Different communities used different texts. Some valued letters and Gospels that were later excluded. Others were slow to accept books we now consider central. The Book of Revelation, for instance, was controversial in parts of the early church for quite some time. The first known list that matches exactly what we now call the New Testament appears in a letter written by Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, in 367 CE, nearly 340 years after the death of Jesus. The Council of Carthage in 397 CE formally affirmed this list. The question of which Old Testament books to include was never definitively resolved across all Christian traditions. As we discussed, it remains a point of difference today. What I want to be clear about, and this is where I differ from some of the more skeptical voices on this subject, is that the process of canon formation was not simply powerful men in a room deciding what to include for political reasons. It was that, partially, power is always a factor in human institutions. But it was also a genuinely discernment-oriented process. Asking, does this text reflect the apostolic witness? Is it consistent with what the early communities taught about Jesus? Has it been received broadly across the church? Those are not arbitrary criteria. They reflect a serious attempt to identify what is authentic. The result is not perfect. We cannot know with certainty that every decision made in those councils was correct. But the outcome, the Bible as we have it, has a depth, a coherence, and an influence that deserves to be engaged on its own terms. So we come to the second half of the title. Does it still matter when the Bible was written? I think the answer is yes, and here is why. When you read the book of Revelation knowing that it was written in the late 1st century, during a period of intense persecution under the Roman Emperor Domitian, when Christians were being executed for refusing to worship the emperor as a god, the entire texture of that book changes. The beast is not a prediction of a future political figure. It is a coded protest against an all-too-present empire. That does not make it irrelevant to us. It makes it more relevant because it becomes a book about how people of faith survive under crushing power, and that question is permanently relevant. When you read Paul's letter to the Galatians knowing the specific crisis he was addressing, Jewish Christian teachers insisting that Gentile converts must be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law to be truly saved, his arguments become sharper, more urgent, more comprehensible. You stop reading it as an abstract theological treatise and start reading it as a letter from a man who is furious because he believes people are being led away from something that set them free. Context does not diminish the Bible. Context illuminates it. And I would argue, this is a personal conviction, that a faith built on historical engagement with the text is more durable than one built on a kind of sacred blur, where the details don't matter and everything is read as timeless instruction without origin or audience. The Bible did not fall from the sky fully formed. It grew. It was shaped by history, by crisis, by community, by debate. And it survived. That survival, through empires, through persecutions, through every attempt to suppress or distort it, is itself worth taking seriously. If you made it this far, thank you genuinely. This kind of content is not the easiest to sit with. It challenges assumptions. It asks you to hold complexity. And I believe that is exactly where some of the most meaningful engagement with faith happens. This video is part of an ongoing series called Bible Foundations, where we go back to the ground level and ask the questions that most people assume have been answered, but haven't been asked carefully. Next, we are going to look at one of the most fascinating and unsettling questions in all of biblical scholarship. Of the 40 authors credited with writing scripture, who were they, really? What do we actually know about them? And why do their identities matter more than most people realize? If that interests you, subscribe to Light of Grace and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it when it goes up. Leave a comment below. What is the one thing from this video that surprised you most? I read every comment, and those conversations genuinely shape where this channel goes next. I'll see you in the next